An idea that promised everything. In the early days, it sounded like the perfect idea. A new kind of nation. No king. No inherited power. No ruling class by birth. Instead, the people would govern themselves. To many, this seemed like the future of humanity. To others, it sounded reckless and dangerous. Even some of the men who created it were not sure it would survive. One of them warned that it would only last if the people remained virtuous. Another feared it would collapse into chaos or tyranny. This was the American experiment. And long before the world began arguing about its success or failure, the experiment started producing consequences no one fully expected. What the experiment really was. The United States was not founded simply as a new country. It was founded as a test. The founders believed they were attempting something history had never sustained for long, a large republic governed by ordinary citizens rather than monarchs or emperors. At the time, most powerful nations were ruled by kings. Political authority flowed downward from royal families, religious institutions, or military elites. The American founders rejected this structure. They argued that power should flow upward, from the people. The idea was built on several key principles. Government exists to serve the people. Power must be limited and divided. Citizens must participate in public life. No individual should rule permanently. On paper, this system promised freedom, stability, and fairness. But it also depended on assumptions that would later prove fragile. It assumed voters would be informed. It assumed leaders would act responsibly. It assumed institutions would restrain ambition. Most importantly, it assumed that a shared national identity would overcome deep social, economic, and regional differences. That assumption would be tested almost immediately. A nation born with contradictions. From the start, the American experiment contained unresolved contradictions. The most obvious was slavery. While the new nation declared that all men are created equal, millions of people were enslaved within its borders. The founders knew this contradiction existed. Some believed slavery would fade away naturally. Others believed confronting it directly would destroy the fragile union. So they compromised. Those compromises allowed the nation to form, but they planted conflicts that would later explode. There were other contradictions as well. Voting rights were limited mostly to white men with property. Women were excluded from political participation. Native populations were pushed aside or ignored entirely. The promise of equality existed more as an ideal than a reality. Still, many believed time would fix these problems. They thought gradual reform would correct early mistakes. The system only needed patience. But history rarely follows gentle paths. The fear that never left. Even after independence, American leaders worried constantly that the experiment would fail. They feared foreign interference, internal division, and the rise of demagogues, leaders who could manipulate public emotion for personal power. Political parties formed quickly, despite early warnings against them. These parties hardened disagreements into permanent divisions. Elections became battles for control rather than discussions about policy. Economic inequality also grew early. While the nation rejected aristocracy, wealth quickly concentrated in certain regions and families. This created tension between ordinary citizens and political elites. The government responded by expanding slowly, taking on responsibilities that the founders had not fully anticipated. Each expansion brought new power and new risks. The system was working, but it was already strained. Expansion and consequences. As the United States expanded westward, the experiment grew larger and more complex. New states joined the Union, each with different interests and identities. The balance between free states and slave states became a constant source of conflict. Expansion brought opportunity, but it also brought violence. Native communities were displaced. Treaties were broken. Entire populations were forced to move. The experiment promised liberty, but it was built through coercion and exclusion. By the mid-19th century, the contradictions could no longer be ignored. The system designed to prevent tyranny was tearing itself apart. The result was the American Civil War. When the experiment nearly ended, the Civil War was not just a fight over territory or policy. It was a direct test of whether the American experiment could survive internal collapse. The nation split into two. Millions died. Cities burned. Families were divided. For a moment, it appeared that the idea of a united republic had failed completely. When the war ended, the United States remained intact, but deeply scarred. Slavery was abolished, but equality was not achieved. Reconstruction promised reform but delivered instability and resentment. The experiment continued, but it had already gone terribly wrong in ways that could not be undone. A stronger state, a weaker ideal. After the Civil War, the federal government became stronger than ever before. This helped stabilize the country, but it also shifted power away from local communities. Industrialization accelerated this change. Corporations grew powerful. Workers became dependent on systems they did not control. Wealth inequality widened. Democracy survived, but it became increasingly complex and distant from ordinary citizens. The experiment was no longer fragile, it was massive. And when massive systems fail, they do not fail quietly. The rise of industrial power. After the Civil War, the United States entered a period of rapid industrial growth. Railroads expanded across the continent. Factories multiplied in cities. New technologies changed how people worked and lived. This growth created enormous wealth, but it also created deep inequalities. A small group of industrial leaders gained control over railways, steel production, oil, and finance. These individuals were not elected, yet they held influence that rivaled governments. The political system struggled to respond. Laws moved slowly, while industries moved quickly. Corruption became common at local and national levels. Business interests funded political campaigns, shaped regulations, and influenced public policy. The experiment had assumed that power would remain balanced. Instead, economic power began to outweigh political accountability. Democracy meets mass society. As the population grew, the nature of democracy changed. The early republic had been small, local, and personal. Now it was large, urban, and distant. Political participation became less about direct involvement and more about representation through institutions. Campaigns grew expensive. Media began shaping public opinion on a national scale. Political parties became permanent structures. Loyalty to party identity often replaced debate over ideas. Elections became contests of messaging rather than discussions of governance. This shift did not destroy democracy, but it altered it. Citizens still voted, but many felt increasingly disconnected from the decisions made in their name. War and the expansion of state power. The 20th century brought new challenges. 2 world wars forced the federal government to take on unprecedented authority. To mobilize armies and industries, the state expanded its reach into the economy and daily life. After World War II, the United States emerged as a global power. With this status came new responsibilities and new fears. The Cold War led to permanent military readiness, intelligence agencies, and large defense budgets. These changes were justified as necessary for survival. But they also concentrated power in the executive branch and reduced public oversight. The experiment had not planned for a permanent security state. Prosperity and unequal outcomes. Post-war prosperity improved living standards for many Americans. Suburbs expanded. Education access increased. Consumer goods became widely available. But not everyone benefited equally. Racial segregation continued. Economic opportunity remained uneven. Many communities were excluded from growth. Government programs attempted to address these issues, but solutions were often incomplete or poorly implemented. Social trust weakened as different groups experienced different realities. The promise of equal opportunity existed, but access to it remained unequal. Culture, media, and influence. As television and mass media expanded, political communication changed again. Leaders now spoke to millions at once. Image became as important as policy. Public debate became simplified. Complex issues were reduced to slogans. Fear and identity became powerful political tools. The experiment relied on an informed public. Instead, the public was increasingly shaped by selective information and emotional narratives. The illusion of stability. By the late 20th century, the United States appeared stable and successful. Its economy was large. Its military was unmatched. Its institutions remained intact. But beneath the surface, trust was eroding. Voters doubted politicians. Communities felt unheard. Economic pressures increased for working families. The system continued functioning, but it relied more on inertia than consensus. The experiment was no longer fragile, but it was no longer healthy either. The Cold War led to permanent military readiness, intelligence agencies, and large defense budgets. These changes were justified as necessary for survival. But they also concentrated power in the executive branch and reduced public oversight. The experiment had not planned for a permanent security state. Prosperity and unequal outcomes. Post-war prosperity improved living standards for many Americans. Suburbs expanded. Education access increased. Consumer goods became widely available. But not everyone benefited equally. Racial segregation continued. Economic opportunity remained uneven. Many communities were excluded from growth. Government programs attempted to address these issues, but solutions were often incomplete or poorly implemented. Social trust weakened as different groups experienced different realities. The promise of equal opportunity existed, but access to it remained unequal. Culture, media, and influence. As television and mass media expanded, political communication changed again. Leaders now spoke to millions at once. Image became as important as policy. Public debate became simplified. Complex issues were reduced to slogans. Fear and identity became powerful political tools. The experiment relied on an informed public. Instead, the public was increasingly shaped by selective information and emotional narratives. The illusion of stability. By the late 20th century, the United States appeared stable and successful. Its economy was large. Its military was unmatched. Its institutions remained intact. But beneath the surface, trust was eroding. Voters doubted politicians. Communities felt unheard. Economic pressures increased for working families. The system continued functioning, but it relied more on inertia than consensus. The experiment was no longer fragile, but it was no longer healthy either. Globalization and disconnection. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the American economy became deeply connected to the global system. Manufacturing moved overseas. Supply chains stretched across continents. Corporations expanded beyond national borders. These changes lowered costs and increased profits, but they also weakened local economies. Many industrial towns lost jobs. Skilled labor became less secure. Workers were told the economy was growing, but their own conditions did not improve. The political system struggled to respond. Economic benefits were unevenly distributed, and government support often arrived too late or not at all. This gap between national success and personal experience created resentment. The experiment depended on shared outcomes. Globalization fractured that shared experience. Technology changes public life. Technology transformed communication. The internet removed barriers to information, but it also removed filters. Anyone could publish anything. Algorithms rewarded attention, not accuracy. Social media platforms amplified outrage, fear, and identity-based messaging. Political discussions moved from town halls to digital spaces where nuance was rare. Misinformation spread faster than corrections. Trust in traditional institutions, media, government, education, declined. The founders imagined citizens gathering to debate ideas. Instead, many Americans existed in separate information environments, each convinced the other was dangerous or dishonest. Polarization becomes permanent. Political disagreement hardened into identity. Party affiliation became tied to personal values, social identity, and cultural belonging. Compromise became a sign of weakness. Cooperation became suspicious. Political success was measured by defeating opponents rather than solving problems. This environment rewarded extreme rhetoric. Leaders who promised simple solutions gained attention, even when those solutions ignored complexity. The system was still democratic, but it was increasingly adversarial. Institutions under strain. As trust declined, institutions weakened. Courts, elections, law enforcement, and public agencies became targets of suspicion. Some criticism was justified. Institutions had made mistakes and failed to represent all citizens fairly. But constant doubt made reform difficult. When people no longer believed in the system, they stopped defending it. The experiment required legitimacy. Without trust, even well-designed institutions struggled to function. Inequality and perceived injustice. Economic inequality reached levels not seen in generations. Wealth concentrated at the top. Housing, healthcare, and education became harder to access. Many citizens felt the system favored a small group while ignoring ordinary people. Protests increased. Political movements formed around anger rather than policy. The promise of fairness became harder to defend. Crisis without resolution. By the early 21st century, the American experiment faced multiple crises at once. Economic pressure, cultural conflict, technological disruption, and political mistrust reinforced each other. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, there was a slow erosion of confidence. The system continued operating, but fewer people believed it worked for them. An experiment still running. Despite its problems, the American experiment did not end. The Constitution remained in place. Elections continued. Courts still functioned. Government institutions operated day to day. But survival was not the same as success. Many Americans no longer viewed the system as fair or responsive. Trust in leadership declined across generations. Political participation remained high in moments of crisis, but long-term engagement weakened. The experiment continued, but under strain. The cost of lost confidence. When citizens lose faith in institutions, the effects are slow but deep. Rules begin to feel optional. Laws appear selective. Authority is questioned not on principle, but on loyalty. In this environment, power shifts toward those who can control narratives rather than those who can solve problems. Emotional appeal becomes more influential than evidence. The founders feared this outcome. They warned that democracy depended on civic responsibility and shared reality. Without those, freedom could not sustain itself. The limits of reform. Reform efforts emerged from across the political spectrum. Some focused on expanding participation. Others aimed to limit government power. Many sought to restore accountability. Yet reform faced resistance. Established interests protected their influence. Polarization blocked compromise. Short-term political gain often outweighed long-term stability. The system allowed reform, but it did not guarantee it. The burden of scale. One challenge the founders never fully solved was scale. The American system was designed for a small republic, not a vast and diverse nation of hundreds of millions. As scale increased, representation became less personal. Decision-making moved further from daily life. Citizens felt disconnected from power. Technology could have narrowed this gap. Instead, it often widened it by failure or transformation rather than clarity. Whether the American experiment truly went terribly wrong depends on perspective. It succeeded in avoiding monarchy. It expanded rights over time. It influenced democratic movements worldwide. But it also failed to deliver consistent equality, stability, or trust. Its institutions proved vulnerable to concentration of power, economic imbalance, and social division. The experiment did not collapse. It transformed into something less idealistic and more conflicted than its creators imagined. The unfinished question. The American experiment was never meant to be finished. It was designed to adapt. But adaptation requires shared purpose. Without trust, reforms weaken. Without participation, representation fades. Without common ground, governance becomes conflict management rather than collective progress. The future of the experiment remains uncertain, not because it cannot survive, but because survival alone is no longer enough. What was once a bold test of self-government now stands as a warning and a lesson. An experiment can endure for centuries and still fall short.